Okay, this one is about indentured servants. An indentured servant would be a temporary slave, and they were this concept of temporary slave, of an indentured servant, lasted primarily from the 1500s to the late 1800s. It was more popular the closer you get to 1500s, and it concluded along with full chattel slavery. Um, in the late 1800s would be at the end of the Civil War in the 1860s. The difference between the two is an indentured servant is temporary, and a person that is a part of chattel slavery is someone who is a slave for life. Their kids are going to be slaves for lives, and legally they're not even considered real people. They're considered property, a thing, a piece of equipment. Whereas an indentured servant was still considered a person, but their labor, their work was going to be usable by the person who owns them until their contract is up. Okay. So an indentured servant or indentured laborer, uh, sometimes also called, is an employee. They're owned by contract, so they work for this person. They're an employee, and the person is called the indenturee. So the indenturee, the person who is an indentured servant, is inside of a system of unfree labor. So it's not free labor, it's not full slavery, it's unfree. They're getting something for this. Who is bound by a signed or forced contract. The contract is called an indenture. This would be a real primary source of an indenture. And once you sign it, you are then a temporary slave until the parts inside of it saying when it ends comes to a conclusion. To work for a particular employer, the person who also signs this with you, for a fixed time, so it's not going to last forever. The contract often lets the employer sell the labor of an indenturee to a third party. So, for example, if I am a indentured servant, if I am an indenturee, my employer, my owner who has my contract, they can advertise to their buddies, hey, I got a guy who will work for you. You pay me money and he will go work for you. Or they could sell the whole contract and I'd then be owned by someone else. Indenturees usually enter into an indenture, so the person normally signs a contract for a specific payment or some other benefit or to meet a legal obligation, such as debt bondage. Now, in the context of early U.S. history, the most common and most usually talked about example of an indentured servant would be poor person in England wants to go to the 13 colonies, but poor person doesn't have money. So they go to a lord or they go to a merchant and they say, hey, if you'll pay for me to get to go to the New World, I'll be a slave for 5 or 10 years and I'll work however you want. And at the end of that, I want to be a free man and I want to have some money and I want to have some land so they can start and try and have a better life. So on completion of the contract, indentured servants were given their freedom and occasionally plots of land. So this is a real indenture signed by Henry Mayer, a real person. Now Henry Mayer did not know how to read or write, so he wrote an X and then someone else wrote Henry Mayer. And this happened in 1738. This contract bound Mayer to a man named Abraham Heston of Bucks County in Pennsylvania, who had paid for Mayer to travel to Europe. Now, why did people in early Jamestown and early 13 colonies, why did they want indentured servants? Why did they want slaves of any kind? Well, a lot of it was because of tobacco. People would grow tobacco, and these had these huge leaves, and you would have to take them, and they're very heavy because they were very wet, and you have to dry them out very carefully. And it was very, very hard, difficult work. And remember, the first people who came over were nobility. They didn't like to work at all. That's why people like John Smith had to tell them, he who will not work will not eat. This is also why you have the first instance of the Dutch bringing the very first group of 20 African slaves, and the people in Jamestown were buying them. Now, like I said when I was reading the Jamestown article, um, these first African slaves are coming to a British colony, and by British law, slavery didn't really have any laws. So it's very possible that these first African slaves were not full slaves like you think with chattel slavery, like we think of being ended by the Civil War. It's very possible that these first slaves were actually indentured servants, but we don't really know. And the other instance of indentured servitude that is really on the creepy side would be women. The first instance of people coming to the United States, well, it's not the United States yet, but the 13 colonies, they were men, they were boys. And when they got here and they made their lives for themselves, they then wanted to start families. Well, the 3-month journey across the ocean was brutally horrible, and women generally were considered bad luck on ships, so women weren't coming on these first trips. And many women didn't want to go because it was so dangerous. So some women who had committed crimes or owed money or were in a bad situation back in Europe, in England, might want to say, hey, I'll go, or be forced into, you're going to go to the New World, and the men that are there could pay for you to get there, and you'd be an indentured servant. The harsh thing about this situation is you're going to be an indentured servant so that way they can marry you. And then once you're married, once indentured servitude ends, well, the marriage doesn't. So in this instance, it would last for life, because legally back then, a wife was the property of her husband. We've come a long ways since then, haven't we? And if you do a Google search on this stuff, it's really easy to find imagery on this. It was a relatively common way to get women to go to the New World, although very creepy indeed. So I hope you learned something out of this, and I hope it helps you.